So good morning, everyone. My name is Arafat, and I teach history on the Testbook platform. So in this session, let us take a look at the eighth chapter of the eighth standard NCERT. Just a minute. So we will, in today's class, we will be discussing the eighth chapter of the eighth standard NCERT, the social sciences NCERT at a point. So this is basically, this chapter is on the national movement. So in today's topic, we will be taking a look at the overall developments in India between 1870 to 1947. Got the point. So let me clarify in the beginning itself. In today's class, we will be discussing the developments. We will take a look at the overall developments in India between 1870 to 1947. We call this period as the period of the national movement. Usually, we refer to the period between 1870, 1880 to 1947 as the period of the national movement. Got the point. So in this class, we will be taking a look at the overall developments during this period, that is 1870 to 1947. But before we do that, let us take a look at what all we have discussed so far. So far we have completed 7 chapters of the 8th standard NCERT. In fact, today's session is the last chapter of 8th standard NCERT. So take a look at the topics which we have discussed so far. We have seen how the British conquered different territories of India. Then we have seen how British went about introducing new laws and new administrative systems in India. So for example, we have discussed the revenue policies of the British. Got my point. So then we have also discussed how these revenue policies began to affect the peasants and the tribes. I have discussed with you the tribal revolts. Got my point. And I have also discussed with you why tribals revolted. Got my point. Then we have taken a look at the educational policies followed by the British. Got my point. So in the last couple of classes, in the last but one class, I had a discussion with you on the educational policies followed by the British, how the British started establishing educational institutions, etc., etc. That part I have discussed with you. Then I have discussed with you in last class the social policies or the socio-religious reform movement. I have discussed with you. So I have discussed with you the general conditions of women in the 19th century India. Got my point. Then I have discussed with you the existence of caste system and the challenges it posed. Got my point. And I have discussed with you the socio-religious reform. Then finally, in the last couple of classes, I have also discussed a major revolt that broke out against the British. That is the Sepoys revolt. I have discussed with you why Sepoys revolted. That part I have discussed with you. So these were the issues which I have covered in the last couple of classes. Now come to the last chapter of the 8th standard NCERT, that is the making of the national movement. Basically, this is a chapter dealing with the national movement, the overall developments during the national movement. So I told you the time period between 1870 to 1947 is often referred to as the period of the national movement. At the point. So what is nationalism? Before we discuss nationalism, before we discuss national movement, let us discuss what we mean by the term. What is the meaning of the term nationalism? At the point. So nationalism is basically a desire among a group of people belonging to a certain race or a certain religion or a certain geographical area or a certain culture or a combination of all of this to form an independent country for themselves is called nationalism. So, what is nationalism? It is basically a feeling, a desire among a group of people either belonging to a particular religion or speaking a particular language or living in a certain geographical area or people having a distinct culture to form an independent country for themselves is called nationalism. And this nationalism essentially began to grow in India from 1870s onwards. So from 1870s onwards, uh, a section of Indians began to argue that for India to become a developed nation, it should come out of the colonial rule. Basically, a section of Indians began to argue that India should become an independent country if at all, if it wants to get rid all of its problems. So that's how nationalism began to grow from 1970 onwards. Got my point? So the growth of nationalism in India is directly linked to the growth of political associations. The growth of nationalism in India is in a way related to the growth of political associations in India. So from 1850s onwards, or in the post 1850 period, numerous political associations began to come into existence in India. Let me repeat this point once again. I just discussed with you what I mean by nationalism, and I told you that this growth of nationalism in a way is linked to the growth of political associations. And these political associations began to come into existence in the post 1850 period. Some of these associations include, say for example, Pune Sarvajanik Sabha. It was founded in post 1850 period. Then Indian Association, this Pune Sarvajanik Sabha was mostly active in the Bombay Presidency region. In Bombay Presidency region. Then Indian Association, it was also founded in post 1850s. So Indian Association was by and large active in the Bengal Presidency. The Bengal Presidency. Then we have Madras Mahajan Sabha. Got your point? So active in the Madras Presidency. Madras Presidency. Then we have another association in Bombay called the Bombay Presidency Association, was also active in Bombay Presidency. Bombay Presidency. So the whole point is, in the post 1850 period, numerous political associations began to come into existence. That's the point. So these associations in a way began to promote the idea of a nation among the Indians. These political associations began to take up the problems of the Indians. These political associations in a way began to fight for the rights of the Indians. Got my point? So for example, in the post 1850s, I told you these different political associations came, and these political associations began taking up various issues. They began taking up they began taking up fight against the British. They began raising different issues before the British. So for example, one such issue which these political associations raised was the Arms Act, which was passed in 1878. So this Arms Act was a very discriminatory piece of legislation, because under the Arms Act, the Indian people were prohibited from possessing arms, while the same provision was not applicable to the British. So what is this Arms Act? Under the Arms Act, Indians were prohibited from possessing arms, while the same act was not made applicable to the British, that is the British citizens. So basically, this Arms Act was a very discriminatory piece of legislation. So the political associations which I just discussed with you took up campaign against the Arms Act. And similarly, they took up campaign against the Vernacular Press Act 1878. So, under the Vernacular Press Act, serious or severe restrictions were imposed on the Indian press. The British began imposing restrictions on the Indian press through the provisions or under the provisions of the Vernacular Press Act. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, what is the purpose of the Vernacular Press Act? Its purpose was to censor news published in the Indian newspapers. So through this act, uh, the British government sought to curb the free speech available to the press. So therefore, the political associations, uh, which I just discussed with you, began carrying campaign against the Vernacular Press Act. And similarly, the Ilbert Bill controversy. So the Ilbert Bill. So basically, till 1883, the Indian judges were not allowed to prosecute a Britisher. Basically, Indians by 1883 were allowed to become judge, but Indian judges were not allowed to try Europeans. They were not allowed to hear any case in which an European is an accused. So the Ilbert Bill sought to undo this anomaly. Basically, under the Ilbert Bill, this Ilbert Bill allowed even the Indian judges to hear a case in which an accused is an European. So basically, the Ilbert Bill is a very progressive piece of legislation, but under severe opposition from the Britishers, the British Governor General eventually dropped the Ilbert Bill. Let me repeat this point once again. What is this Ilbert Bill? The point is, till 1883, the Indian judges were not allowed to listen a case, or they were not allowed to preside over a case in which an accused happened to be an European. So under the Ilbert Bill, this discrimination began to be removed. This discrimination sought to be removed. So under the Ilbert Bill in a way allowed even the Indian judges to preside over a case in which the accused happened to be an European. So basically, the Ilbert Bill is a very progressive piece of legislation. But I just told you that the British people severely opposed the Ilbert Bill. So therefore, under a lot of opposition, as a result of lot of opposition from the British people, the Ilbert Bill had to be dropped. And therefore, once this bill was dropped, it generated a lot of controversy. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, there were these were the political associations that existed in India in the post 1850 time period, and these early political associations carried out campaign against various discriminatory policies of the British. The case in point is the Arms Act, the Vernacular Press Act, the Ilbert Bill controversy, etc., etc. Got my point. But what was the outcome of these campaigns carried by these regional political associations? What was the outcome of this campaign? The point is, these regional political associations could not achieve much success. Of course, they did carry out the campaign to the best of their ability, but the outcome of these campaigns was not much. It was not much. So these regional political associations, or the leaders of these regional political associations, realized that they were not very successful in carrying these campaigns against these discriminatory policies of the British, because their political associations happen to be regional associations. The point is, all those political associations that existed prior to that of 1885, prior to that of 1885 were regional political associations. Say for example, Pune Sarvajanik Sabha mostly functioned in Bombay Presidency, Indian Association mostly in Bengal Presidency, Madras Mahajan Sabha mostly in Madras Presidency. So the whole point is the leaders of these regional political associations realized that they were not very successful in carrying campaigns against the British policies because they happened to be regional political associations. So therefore, the leaders of these regional political associations decided to form an all India political association. And the first all India political association that came into existence happened to be the Indian National Congress. That was in the year 1885. Is my point clear? So the point is, we usually consider the time period between 1885 to 1947 as the period of the national movement. We consider the time period between 1885 to 1947 as the period of the national movement, for the simple reason that it was in the year 1885 the Indian National Congress was founded. But founded by whom? It was essentially founded by the leaders from different political associations. Leaders of different regional political associations came together and founded an all India political association called the Indian National Congress. So Indian National Congress happened to be India's first all India political association. All India political association. Got to point. So it was under the banner of the Indian National Congress. It was under the banner of the Indian National Congress that the national movement was carried out. Got to point. So it was under the banner of the Indian National Congress that the national movement was carried out. And hence we call the time period from 1885 to 1947 as the period of the national movement. This is what happened. Fine. So we discuss the national movement in a couple of phases. We discuss the national movement in 3 phases. Got my point? So national movement, we discuss the national movement in 3 phases. One is we have the moderate phase. One is we have the moderate phase, that's my point, which is between 1885 to 1905. Just a minute. The second phase of the national movement is the extremist phase. The extremist phase, which is between 1905 to roughly say 1920. And third we have is the Gandhian phase. Gandhian phase, which is between 1920 to 1947. 1920 to 1947. Got my point? So we discuss the national movement in 3 phases: the moderate phase, the extremist phase, and the Gandhian phase. Got my point? So basically, during the moderate phase, during the first phase of the national movement is the moderate phase. This phase is called moderate phase because the demands raised by the Congress leaders during the first phase were quite modest. Let me repeat, the first phase of the national movement, is called the moderate phase because the demands raised by the Congress leaders in the first phase were quite modest. They were quite modest. That's the point. So basically, during the first phase, just a minute, during the first phase, the Congress leaders did not demand independence. They only put forward quite modest demands before the British. And hence, we call the first phase of the national movement as the moderate phase. So the point is, there were other sections within the Congress party. So there was another group existing within the Congress party called the extremists. These extremists were always opposed to the politics of the moderates of the Indian National Congress. Let me repeat this point once again for you. So the Congress had right from the beginning various groups in it. One group of the Indian National Congress came to be referred to as the moderates. That's the point. Just a minute. They came to be referred to as the moderates. The moderates led the first phase of the national movement between 1885 to 1905. We call this phase of the first phase of the national movement as the moderate phase because the demands put forward by the nationalists during the first phase were quite modest, such as say they demanded reduction in land revenue, they demanded just Indianization of civil services, etc. So the leaders of the national movement of the first phase never ever demanded complete independence of India. Hence, we call the first phase of the national movement as the moderate phase because the demands put forward by the leaders of the first phase happen to be quite moderate, they happen to be quite modest. But the point is, I told you, Congress is known for groups right from the beginning. There were another group of leaders within the Congress party who came to be referred to as the extremists. So the extremists were always opposed to the moderate methods of politics. The extremists always opposed the demands put forward by the moderates before the British. So the extremists, in a way, over a period of time began to become popular within the Congress party. The extremists, in a way, became popular. They took over the leadership of the Congress party in 1905. Let me repeat this point once again for you. So Congress is known for groupism, or it is known for having groups right from its inception. There was a group within the Congress party which came to be referred to as the extremist group. These extremists were always critical. They were always critical of the moderate methods of politics. They always opposed the moderate methods of politics. Initially, the supporters within the Congress party, the supporters of the extremists within the Congress party remained very low. But as the time passed by, with time, the extremists began to become popular, and by 1905, they in a way became very popular in the Congress party. And in fact, from 1905 AD onwards, they took over in a way the leadership of the Congress party. That's my point. So the extremists, on the other hand, began to they were not at all they were not convinced with the moderate methods of politics, and it was during the extremist phase, or it was during the extremist, it was under the extremist leadership that the Congress party carried out India's first mass movement called the Swadeshi Movement. I just told you, take a look at this slide once again. The time period between 1885 to 1905 is called the moderate phase. I already explained to you why we call this as a moderate phase, because the demands put forward by the Congress party during this phase was quite modest. And I told you that there was another group within the Congress party called the extremists, otherwise called the radicals. These extremists are basically Bala Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, and Lala Lajpat Rai. These three are the most important of the extremist leaders, and these three basically were severely opposed to the moderate methods of politics. That's the point. And it was under the leadership of these three leaders that the Congress party launched and carried out a mass movement in India called the Swadeshi Movement. So basically, in 1905 AD, the British carried out the partition of Bengal. in 1905 AD, the British carried out the partition of Bengal. So this partition of Bengal became the immediate reason for the Congress party to launch the Swadeshi movement. Basically, the British, citing administrative convenience as a reason, carried out the partition of Bengal. The British, citing administrative convenience as a reason, carried out the partition of Bengal. But its real intention was to crush the national movement, which was growing stronger by the day in the Bengal region. So the point is, nationalism was gaining strength by the day in the Bengal region. So the British government sought to curtail the growth of the national movement, and therefore it in a way carried out the partition of Bengal. But while carrying out the partition of Bengal, the British government suggested that it intended to carry out the partition of Bengal for administrative convenience. I hope I'm clear. So the point is, the Congress leaders were opposed to the partition of Bengal. When the British, despite opposition from the Congress, carried out the partition of Bengal, decided to, that is, in opposition to the partition of Bengal, the Congress leaders carried out a mass movement in India called the Swadeshi Movement. So the Swadeshi Movement happened to be India's first mass movement, but this movement was carried out by and large under the leadership of the extremists, not the moderates. This movement was by and large carried out under the leadership of the extremists. At the point, but by about 1908, the British succeeded in completely crushing the Swadeshi movement. Most of the extremist leaders either took retirement from politics, or most of the extremist leaders, they were put behind the bars. That is, they were arrested and kept in prison. And therefore, the Swadeshi movement itself came to an end by 1908. At the point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, the Swadeshi movement by and large was a movement carried out by the extremists. It was carried out in opposition or in protest against the British decision to partition Bengal into two. At the point. So the name itself suggests it was during the Swadeshi movement that a call was given by the nationalist leaders to use only the made in India goods. The made in India goods. A call was given by the nationalists to boycott the British manufactured goods and use only the made in India goods. That's the point. So the whole point which I'm trying to convey is, the Swadeshi movement 1905 happened to be India's first mass movement, by and large carried out under the leadership of the extremists. But what was the core message of the Swadeshi movement? The nationalist leaders gave a call to the people of India to use only made in India goods and boycott the British manufactured goods. So to some extent it was a successful movement. But by 1908, the Swadeshi movement was completely crushed by the British. The Swadeshi movement ended because the British arrested and kept the extremist leaders in prison. There was none to carry out the movement, and hence by 1908, the Swadeshi movement itself came to an end. That's the point. Now come to the major developments in 1920s. Between 1910 and 1920, what happened in India? Let us take a look at those major developments. So basically, the first major development between 1910 and 1920 is the outbreak of World War I. So World War I was fought between 1914 and 1918, fought between 1914 to 1918 at the point. So the World War I, Britain was very actively involved in World War I. That's the point. So Indian soldiers, that is the Indian sepoys, were also forced by the British to participate in the World War I. So in fact, under the pressure of the British, Indians very actively participated in World War One. But the World War One caused great economic distress to Indians. It caused great economic distress to Indians. So, for example, during World War One, the British basically diverted the essentials to meet the needs of the armed forces. So, for example, the food grains produced in India began to be diverted by the British to meet the needs of the armed forces, working in different parts of the world. So as a result, what happened? There was a severe shortage of food grains in India. The inflation was rising. So the whole point is the economic the people of India in 19 that is between 1914 to 1918 were under great economic stress. They were under duress. Let me repeat this point once again. The whole point is I am trying to explain to you the major developments in India between 1910 to 1920. One major development is World War One. So I told you during World War One, the British began to divert food grains to meet the needs of the armed forces. So this diversion created a shortage of goods in the Indian economy, Indian market. That's the point. So the prices of the food grains began to skyrocket. Inflation was very, very high, and as a result, the people were under great stress. The people of India were under great stress. So this is the development number one between 1910 to 1920. Got my point? So the whole point is by this time, the people of India really got fed up with the British rule. That is, after World War One, as a result of the economic hardships caused by the World War One, the people of India in a way got fed up with the British rule. So that is the first outcome in 1910 to 1920 period. Then the second major outcome is the emergence of Mahatma Gandhi onto the national scene. So basically, Mahatma Gandhi lived in South Africa between 1893 to 1915. He took up a fight against racial discrimination in South Africa. That is, Gandhiji took up a fight against racial discrimination in South Africa. So it was only in 1915 Gandhiji returned back to India. Then after returning back to India, Gandhiji took up three local movements. He provided leadership to three local movements which were very, very successful movements. So the one is we have the Champaran Satyagraha, which is basically a peasant movement of Bihar. Then we have Kheda Satyagraha, which is another peasant movement of Gujarat. And third is we have a movement called Ahmedabad Mill Strike, which is basically a movement carried out by the laborers for increase in their wages. So let me repeat this point once again. Mahatma Gandhi returned back to India in 1915. Then thereafterwards, under his leadership, three movements were carried out. These three happen to be the very early movements carried out by Gandhiji. One happened to be the Champaran Satyagraha. The second is the Kheda Satyagraha. The third is Ahmedabad Mill Strike. Got my point? So Kheda, the first and the second, the Champaran and Kheda, happen to be the peasant movements. And the third one, the Ahmedabad Mill Strike, happened to be a movement carried out by the factory workers for increase in their wages. So the leadership for all these three movements was provided by Gandhiji, and these three movements in a way were very, very successful movements. These three movements in a way were very, very successful movements. So the success of these movements made Gandhiji a very, very popular personality in India. That is, after the success of these three movements, the popularity of Gandhiji skyrocketed. The popularity of Gandhiji was at an all-time high. That's the point. People began to look to Mahatma Gandhi as some kind of a messiah. The point is, people began to look up to Mahatma Gandhi as some kind of a messiah. All this happened because of the success achieved by Gandhiji in the first three of his movements, that is, in the movements which he led. The three, that is Champaran, Kheda, and Ahmedabad mill strike. So, the point is, under the leadership of Gandhiji, the Congress party launched and carried out three mass movements in India. One is the non-cooperation movement, the second is the civil disobedience movement, and third is the Quit India movement. So the whole point is, under the leadership of Gandhiji, the Congress party launched and carried out three mass movements in India between 1920 to 1947. So between 1920 to 1947, three major mass movements were carried out by the Congress party. So the backdrop is clear now. So the point is, from 1920s onwards, we see large participation of people in the national movement. Of course, in Swadeshi movement also, we see considerable, we see large number of people participating in the movement, but the national movement became a mass movement in its true sense between 1920 to 1947. Let me repeat this point once again for you. The Swadeshi movement undoubtedly saw for the first time participation of a large number of Indians, but it was from 1920s onwards, the national movement indeed became a very, very mass movement. But why did that happen? It happened directly as a result of the impact of World War I is reason number one. The point is, as a result of World War I, different sections of the Indian society were fed up with the British rule, and the people began to realize that the only way to end their problems was to make India, or was by making India as an independent nation. That's the point. So the point is, peasants got fed up with the British rule, the artisans got fed up with the British rule. So different sections of the Indian society by about 1920 got fed up with the British rule. Directly, it was a result of the problem, the impact the war created on them. The World War I created on them. The second reason why the movement became mass movement is because of Mahatma Gandhi. So Mahatma Gandhi led three movements in India, three initial movements in India. That is, the initial movements led by Gandhiji in India turned out to be very, very successful movements. As a result, the popularity of Gandhiji increased substantially, and it was to a very great extent as a result of Mahatma Gandhi, the national movement became very, very mass movement. That's the point which I'm trying to convey. So under the leadership of Gandhiji, three movements Sri Lakshmi, first is we have the first movement is the Champaran Satyagraha led by Gandhiji. The second movement happened to be the Kheda movement, that is in February. The third is Ahmedabad mill strike. That's the point. Sri Lakshmi. Order here not very important. The whole point is, this chapter is just about providing you with a glimpse of what happened during the national movement. So the whole objective of this chapter is not to discuss in depth all the topics of the national movement. This chapter just aims to provide you with an overall glimpse of the national movement. That's the point. So the point is, I just told you, the Congress party launched and carried out three mass movements in India. One is the non-cooperation, second is the civil disobedience, third is the Quit India movement. That's the point. So the point is, we are running out of time. I will take this remaining part of this class at the point in the next session. Is that okay with you? So I will take up the second half of this 8th chapter in the next class. At the point, it will take another 1 hour maybe to complete this session. So therefore, I will be taking up this discussion in the next class. Fine. So that's all for today. I just explained that what happened till the arrival of Gandhiji to India. I explained to you the outcome of the initial movements led by Gandhiji. The rest of the topic I will be taking up in the next session. Fine. So that's all for today. See you in the next class. Any doubts, anyone?